Hey, this is Scott, and today I'm going to go over some of the basics of DSLR use in order to teach you how you can take control and get the image that you have in mind. So let's get right into it. We're going to talk about the 3 exposure modes that I think are most important and everybody should be trying to use most of the time. Aperture priority, which is marked as AV on Canon cameras. Shutter priority, which is marked as TV. And full-time manual, which is marked with an M. Each of these modes will let you take control of the shutter speed or the aperture, as well as the ISO in different ways. And those 3 things will make up what is called the exposure triangle. And the combination of them will help you to get the exposure that you need in different situations. In all 3 of these modes, you can either manually set your ISO or you can choose auto ISO. And if you choose auto ISO, each camera will have a different level of limits or controls you can place on that auto ISO. So that will be a topic for another time. Aperture priority mode will allow you to control or choose your camera's aperture, and the camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed to balance for that. Aperture is basically the size of the opening in your lens, and of course, if the lens opening is bigger, more light can reach the sensor. What that means is you can have a faster shutter speed or a lower ISO. Aperture is expressed in ratio of the size of the opening to the size of your lens. So actually a smaller number, for example 1.4, 1.8, those will equal a bigger opening. And a larger number like f8 or f11 means a smaller opening. Because you don't really have control over your shutter speed when you're in aperture priority, I do recommend that you keep an eye on what shutter speed the camera is choosing for you, and just make sure that if it gets too slow, which could cause camera shake or motion blur, just raise your ISO a little bit to balance that. Aperture has one other really big effect on your image, and that is controlling how much blur there is in front of and behind your subject. So this could be often used for subject isolation or some kind of artistic effect. And basically a smaller number, a larger opening, will get you a faster change from your in-focus area to the blur behind or in front of your subject. Whereas a smaller opening, a larger f number like f8 or f11, will make that change from sharp to blurry much more gradual, therefore basically making the image look like there's more in focus. What this is called is depth of field. And basically at a wide aperture, a small number, your depth of field is very, very narrow. So you may get the eye in focus, but the ear is out of focus. Whereas a smaller aperture, a larger f number, will give you a deeper depth of field. So you may be able to get the whole person in focus. Depth of field is also largely dependent on how close you are to your subject and how long your lens is. That's again a whole deeper topic, so that will be another video. So next is shutter priority. As the name suggests, this lets you control your shutter speed, and that camera will automatically choose your aperture for you to balance that. So shutter speed is the time that your shutter is open in front of the sensor. And of course, when the shutter is open for a longer time, that gives more chance for light to reach the sensor, and you can use either a smaller aperture or a lower ISO. If you have a faster shutter speed, which means that the shutter is open for a shorter amount of time, then there's less chance for light to reach your sensor, and you're going to need to use a wider aperture or a higher ISO to balance for that. The downside of a slower shutter speed is that there's a chance when you're hand holding, you'll see the effect of camera shake or hand shake on your image. Also, if your subject is moving, a person, an animal, for example, you'll see some motion blur in the subject, and it will cause your image to look non-sharp. Basically, to avoid camera shake, you're going to want to keep your shutter speed at least above 1 over your focal length. So I'll put up some information on screen here to explain that to you a little bit more clearly. But basically, if you have a 50mm lens, you want to keep your shutter speed above 1/50th of a second, for example. If you're on a crop sensor, on Canon, you have a 1.6 times crop factor. And on Nikon, there's a 1.5 times crop factor. You want to calculate that before you think about this shutter speed. The reason for that crop factor is yet again another video. If you're interested, let me know. If you're on a tripod and your subject's not moving, then a slow shutter speed is not usually a problem. It can often be used for some kind of creative effect, for example, motion blur in water, or even star trails. The shutter speed you'll need to stop motion blur will depend on your subject and how fast it's moving. Some basic guidelines could be maybe 1/125th of a second for slow movement, maybe 1/250th of a second for medium walking speed, 1/500th of a second for medium running speed, and maybe 1/800th of a second or 1/1000th of a second or higher for faster action. Again, this will depend on your subject and other conditions, so experiment with it and see what you need for your particular situation. So in each of these modes, aperture priority and shutter priority, the camera is making some decisions for you. So the results may not always be perfectly what you had in mind because you don't have total control. There are ways to overcome this and to push the camera in a way that you have in mind. But before we talk about how to do that, we're going to talk about how the camera is making these decisions for you. So the way it's making these decisions is by using some kind of metering system. And in different cameras, there will be different metering modes. But basically, all cameras will have some essential metering modes. And I think that the two that you should often stick to the most are some kind of evaluative metering, where it's looking at the overall image to make a decision, or spot metering, where it's looking at one point in the image to make a decision. Regardless of which mode you're in, the camera's goal is the same. If you imagine the full range of brightness from pure black to pure white, then the camera is trying to make your overall image, or the point that you've selected, an average brightness of medium gray. The camera will show you an exposure level indicator, either in your viewfinder or on the back screen or on the top panel of your camera. And it will basically be a bar like this, where you can see the range from a darker point to a brighter point. And right in the middle of that is where you want your camera to be, generally speaking, if you want to achieve that well-balanced middle gray brightness of your image. If you have a scene that's a pretty decent balance of bright to dark, then it shouldn't be a problem. And in most situations, this will be fine. So I would recommend generally using evaluative metering. There are some situations where evaluative metering will not give you the results that you want, and often spot metering can help in those cases. So we'll talk about that when the time comes, but first, let's look a little bit more in depth about those situations that evaluative metering may give you trouble. Okay, so the first situation where aperture priority or shutter priority is going to give you problems is when you have something that's at the extreme end of the brightness scale. That means either very close to pure white or very close to pure black. So it's going to see that and it's going to try to squish it down to that middle gray, as we said. So if the scene is supposed to be close to pure white and it gets pushed down to that middle gray, it's going to look darker than it's supposed to be. And oppositely, if something's supposed to be pure black, but the camera tries to push it up to that middle gray, it's going to be brighter than it's supposed to be. As a simple example, I have a white table here, pure white table, and I'm just going to take a picture of that in aperture priority and show you what happens. So as you can see, it looks okay, but it's a little bit darker than it should be. Now, if something is supposed to be closer to one end of the scale, either pure white or pure black, then we can tell the camera to push it back up towards that end. So what that's called is exposure compensation. And on most Canon cameras, it's the wheel in the back here. And as you turn the wheel, you'll see your exposure level indicator moving up or moving down. So for this case, I want to push it up towards the white side of the scale. So I'm going to start off with +1, and we'll see how that looks. So as you can see, that's a little bit brighter and closer to the pure white that it's supposed to be. I'll go up to +2 just to show you how that looks. So you can see that's brighter still, and it's getting closer to actual pure white, which is what it's supposed to be. So you'll have to experiment with how far in the plus or minus direction you'll go with exposure compensation, depending on the situation you're in, how bright it's supposed to be, how much of the frame is taken up by that pure white or pure black object, and just play around with it a little bit. But when the camera is giving you an exposure darker or brighter than you think it should be or than you want it to be, you can use this exposure compensation to make up for that. And oppositely, if you want it to be darker than it should be or brighter than it should be, then you could go in that direction too. But exposure compensation will tell the camera to push it up or push it down on that brightness scale. Now keep in mind, when you're in full manual mode, you don't need to use exposure compensation because the camera is not choosing any setting for you. If you want it to be brighter or darker than the camera thinks it's supposed to be, you just change your aperture or shutter speed or ISO to make that happen. So a situation that you'll likely come across is when you have a subject, say a person for example, in front of a very bright background. In that case, if the person is not taking up a majority of the photo, then your aperture priority or your shutter priority is going to be thrown off by the bright background. It'll try to balance for that like we saw with the white table, and it will push it down and make it darker, which may make the background look good, but in turn, your subject is going to be too dark, and you'll end up having a dark face that you can't see with, maybe a nice background behind them. But let's just use this sweatshirt here as an example to show you what I mean. Let's pretend this is a person. Not a person, but let's pretend it is. So I'm just going to take a couple of shots on aperture priority with no exposure compensation of this person in front of this bright background, and we'll see how it comes out. So as you can see, the person is pretty dark, and if this was a real person, it would be very difficult to see their face. The background may look okay, but the subject is the person, so that's not what we want. So I'm going to use the exposure compensation to push this up to +1 and +2 and +3, just to show you what you get at each of those different values. So you can see in this case, there's an extreme difference between the brightness of this person or sweatshirt and the brightness of the background. So when I pushed it to +3, it was actually the best exposure for this particular subject, but the background was just pure white pretty much. So that's the kind of balance that you're going to have to deal with when you're only using exposure compensation. You could, however, use something like this or this, and you'll get a better exposure. You'll have the darker background, which you want, and instead of brightening the whole image with exposure compensation, you could just use one of those things to bring up the brightness of your subject so it's closer to the brightness of the background, and that's kind of balance. If your subject's not a person or if it's not moving, you could also use a tripod and do what's called exposure bracketing, is when you take a few different shots at different exposure levels and you mix them in post to get the proper exposure for all of the important areas of your image. Of course, if your subject's moving, if it's a person, that's not really an option. So that's where higher dynamic range cameras will come in handy, because with one image, you could balance more in post-processing. You could pull up the shadows or pull down the highlights a lot more than a camera with lower dynamic range. So an example of when you would want to go the opposite way actually is if you have some artistic purpose in mind, for example a silhouette, especially against like a nice sunset or a nice scenic background. Sometimes you want that subject to be dark or even pure black for the purpose of your vision that you want to create. So in that case, we want to tell the camera to actually go darker. So like we said, when we want to tell the camera to go more towards the black side, we're going to use negative exposure compensation. So I'm going to go down to -3 and just show you how that looks with this particular scene. So as you can see, this is not a particularly beautiful scene, but with the exposure compensation to the negative side, this person becomes almost perfect silhouette. You could get it down to a perfect silhouette in post-processing if you want to, but if you have a nice couple in front of a sunset or some other scene that you want that effect with, this is again how you would control your camera and tell it what to do. So this is one of those situations where spot metering could also be really beneficial. Like we said, spot metering will meter in one particular area of your image. So when you have only one particular area that you want to expose for, and the rest is maybe drastically different, and you don't really care about it, then we would use spot metering and get our exposure based on that subject, so the person's face, for example. I'll just show you what I mean. I'm going to put this on no exposure compensation, and I will use spot metering and meter for our subject here. So as you can see, it exposed for the subject, and we got the result like we had before, where the background was really bright, but our subject was properly exposed. So again, if you want to just not think about exposure compensation in this situation, you could use spot metering and expose for your subject. Exposure compensation will still be more control, I guess, because you can, push it a little bit further or a little bit less than the camera thinks it is, even more. Whereas spot metering, it's still the camera thinking. So it depends on what result you get, and just be aware that both of these options are available. Finally, I just want to show you one more time that when you're using evaluative metering, when the subject, for example, this person, takes up a bigger portion of your screen, it's going to be more correctly exposed than when you have the bright background taking up a majority of the scene. So you can see now that even though I'm still on evaluative metering, the subject here is properly exposed because the background is far less percentage of the overall image. It depends on your overall scene. Just be aware that when the majority of your scene is really bright, the camera is going to try and make it darker. The opposite is also true. If the majority of your scene were dark and your subject is a bit brighter, the camera is going to try to make that whole scene brighter. So remember, exposure compensation will help you to tell the camera which way to go when it makes a mistake. So here's a little graph to show you how each of these three settings will affect the others. I've arranged these so the settings on the top mean you'll get brighter image, while the settings on the bottom mean you'll get a darker image. The actual numbers here are just examples, and they may be different from what your camera or your lens is offering. As you open the aperture, which is pushing it towards a smaller number, you or the camera will need to raise the shutter speed. In other words, make it faster. Instead of this, you could also lower the ISO to get the same effect. Of course, if you're already at the lowest possible ISO, that won't be an option. A common situation that you'll come across is that the shutter speed given by the camera's meter will be too slow and either cause hand shake or the subject will show motion blur. To fix this, you can open the aperture wider, but a problem you'll have, especially with kit lenses lacking a wide aperture, is that you'll be limited by that maximum aperture, 5.6 for example. In this case, the only way to speed up your shutter speed would be to raise the ISO to balance it out. All in all, you'll want to try to keep your ISO as low as possible to get the combination of shutter speed and aperture that you want. You'll want to keep your ISO as low as possible because the higher you go, the more image quality you will lose. What ISO is how sensitive your camera or your sensor specifically is to light. The higher ISO will mean you can use faster shutter speeds or smaller apertures, but the image quality will degrade. You'll get a kind of grain in your image called noise, and at higher ISOs the noise even starts to become colored, which just completely ruins the image. You'll also lose some sharpness and dynamic range, which is the camera's ability to capture things closer to pure black and pure white without losing detail. This is especially noticeable in post-processing when you try to brighten the shadows or pull back the highlights, and photographers will argue endlessly about a different camera's performance in this regard. Generally speaking, a camera will do its best in all possible ways at lowest ISO settings. However, a noisy picture may be better than a blurry one, and in most cases, don't be afraid to use it when you need it. Modern DSLRs have gotten quite impressive with higher ISOs, as have mirrorless cameras. Typically, you'll want a shutter speed fast enough to avoid camera shake or motion blur, depending on your lens and on the subject. But, of course, anything faster than that is absolutely okay. The exception to this would be when you're using a tripod and you want a slow shutter speed for some other, usually artistic purpose, such as blurring water or catching star trails. The aperture you choose will depend mostly on how much of the image you want in focus. But in many cases, a wider aperture will also help you get the faster shutter speed that you want. Kit lenses and other cheaper lenses will typically mainly limit you in aperture, so you may need to use a higher ISO to get your shutter speed up. And it may limit the amount of artistic blur you can get behind the subject. This is, of course, depending on the lens. This is where a so-called fast lens could come in handy. A cheap one that many photographers start off with is the nifty 50. This is a fixed, non-zooming 50mm lens with the widest aperture of 1.8. Pretty much all companies have their version of this lens, and while usually they're made mostly from plastic, the newer generations have surprisingly good image quality and very acceptable build. 50mm may be slightly long for some APS-C uses, but it's a very standard focal length for full frame. If you're interested, the best thing to do would be to get your hands on one in a store and see how it feels for you. So just to recap a bit, the 3 exposure modes that I think are most important for you to use to take control of your camera are aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual. I personally don't use shutter priority that much, but it's up to you how it feels and how it fits your situation and style. As we explained, in a lot of situations, a very basic evaluative metering will give you the results that you want, more or less. But now you should know how to take control of your camera to push it in one direction or the other, should that result be different from what you had in mind. Also remember how aperture will affect your image's depth of field, and shutter speed will affect things like motion blur or handshake. So in any of these modes, remember to try and keep your ISO as low as possible to get the combination of shutter speed and aperture that you want to achieve the image that you have in mind. This will help you to keep the cleanest, highest quality image possible, and it's one of the reasons that you'll buy a camera like this instead of a point and shoot or a smartphone. As we mentioned, there's a lot of small details that we could go more in depth to, so let me know in the comments below which points you'd like to hear more about. Again, if you like this video or if you found it informative, please hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more in the future. As always, thank you so much for watching.